Hi, this is Erica Grieder. I'm the Southwest correspondent for The Economist based in Austin, Texas, and I'm here today with Katherine Mangu-Ward.
Hi, I'm a senior editor at Reason Magazine here in Washington, D.C. Looking forward to blogging heads with you today, Erica.
Me too, and I was going to warn you in advance that I'm a little jet lagged today because I've flown to London. So anything extraordinarily strange that I say, I'm going to attribute to that in advance.
Or perhaps to the perspective that you've gained from your international travels. Could be that too.
It's true. I have learned a lot in the past 48 hours about the world and about myself.
mostly about airports.
Yeah. They're as pleasant as you'd imagine all around the world. So I thought we were going to start with kind of the issue of the day, the issue of every day, the issue of our past few years and maybe our entire lives, the question of jobs and where they all went and how to get some.
Yes, that is certainly upon us. I think the person who perhaps said it best and has said it best over and over and over is Nancy Pelosi, who for some reason always says it in threes. She gets that sort of like jobs look about her, which I always find charmingly feverish. So let's talk about good jobs versus bad jobs, or less good jobs, I guess. You've written about this a little bit. When talking about job creation, should we favor quality over quantity? What do you say about that?
Well, it's interesting because, looking at 9.1% unemployment currently, which is about what it's been for the past 2 years, apart from a brief dip into 8.8% earlier this summer or earlier this summer that passed, you'd think that under those conditions, we wouldn't be talking about good jobs versus bad jobs. We would just be saying, we're not snooty, let's get some jobs as fast as we can. But I think that's probably putting it a little bit unfairly. The argument that's emerged from some economists is just that when you're thinking about job creation, you have to look at quality of jobs also. Not that you're choosing to create bad jobs in lieu of the good jobs you might have created if you just had bothered to think about it.
Or if you had more gumption or something. There's always a kind of like...
Or if you cared more about the workers.
Yeah, if your heart was bigger.
One of the interesting kind of questions about it is that when we look at the sectors that have really lost jobs, a lot of the losses have been in what we might term less desirable jobs or mediocre jobs. And I think there's actually a question about whether some of these so-called bad jobs can be created in the United States at this point. So things like manufacturing, how much of that are we going to bring back? I don't know. How do you see this split?
I mean, I think a sort of another component of that question is also the created job versus the stolen job. And I think that's something that's often lost. In particular, I'm thinking here of Rick Perry, who has really made a name for himself and hammered on this point that he's a job creator in Texas, when in fact he's mostly, as far as I can tell, and certainly you're more of an expert on Rick Perry, and isn't that a phrase that you thought you would never say about yourself? But you're more of an expert on Rick Perry than I am, but it actually seems like what he's doing and what a lot of governors, in particular in southern states, are doing is stealing jobs, that they're simply saying, listen, some companies will be essentially indifferent about where they physically locate, so let's bribe them to locate here. And those jobs would have existed no matter what, but we want them in our state. Now, from a selfish perspective, as governor of a state, there's nothing wrong with that, but it also seems like those jobs are often these kind of making stuff jobs that may not be sustainable to keep in the United States in the long run. So, again, that gets us back to this question of if we are creating and or stealing jobs, are they stealing the wrong kind? Are they stealing the kind that are going to be stolen in turn by China shortly in a kind of all is fair in love and job creation world? Right.
And of course, the principle of fairness is one that we should not table casually. But with regard to Perry, looking at the numbers, the thing is that it's maybe it's better to characterize this Texas jobs thing as not so much stealing jobs, but rather stealing people, because really a lot of the job growth is being driven by population growth. In the past decade, the state added 4 million people, bringing us to about 25 million. And a lot of the job growth that we saw, especially in the past 2 years, was in sectors where more people means you need more workers. So there's about a third of the new jobs since 2009, since June of that year, came in education and healthcare. So like teachers, nurses, and so on. That trend kind of holds across sectors because there's only a few where the state has lost jobs, and I think those are construction, manufacturing, and information, which is what you and I do. I don't know why that tragedy isn't discussed more often by politicians like Barry. But yeah, the question of if you're poaching jobs from other states, are you really hurting yourself in the long run because you're failing to invest in the educational pipeline or the human capital, to use that charming phrase, that will eventually yield us better jobs that stay forever? I think that's a concern states should be aware of. I'm not sure how much it's going to be the priority right now because it seems like building your educational pipeline, making those kinds of investments takes at least a couple of years, and the mood of the day seems to be that a couple of years are not readily available for people who are out of work for months on end.
This also, though, I think gets us into what might be kind of the deeper and possibly less resolvable question, which is what does it mean for politicians to create jobs at all? One thing that's been really interesting is Governor Gary Johnson, who continues to kind of scramble for the bottom rung of the Republican candidate race, has said, job creation when he was governor in New Mexico was quite high, and he said, I didn't create a single job. Governors can't create jobs. That's not how it works. And I think while I like his kind of absolutist attitude about that, of course it is true, I think, that government can create certain kinds of jobs in narrow circumstances, right? They can simply say, we are hiring more government workers, and then they have created jobs.
Well, they can probably go a little bit farther than that. I mean, maybe there's a question about, first of all, can governments create jobs? Second of all, should they create jobs when it leads into what we've seen actually in southern states, as you say, as a sort of tacit industrial policy. So I guess beyond the sort of blunt force instrument of hiring people to work in government, do you think there are things governors can do that are appropriate for creating jobs? How far would you extend, tax breaks or subsidies or incentives to certain industries, for example? Right.
I mean, I think it's foolish to deny that government action tremendously influences the desirability of creating jobs. But we use it as a shorthand, and it is a shorthand, right? People don't actually think that, like, Rick Perry waved his magic wand and jobs appeared, out of the Cabbage Patch or whatever. But it's, I think, sometimes a dangerous shorthand in the same way that libertarians and folks who favor free markets often use the shorthand that, like, the market will solve a problem, or, like, the market will, create good outcomes. And I think, what we actually mean is individual people responding to incentives will perhaps do more or less of the thing that we want them to do. And maybe that's just a finicky semantic point, but it does always it skeeves me out a little bit to just hear politicians at all levels saying, I created X jobs during my tenure, partially because it does sort of deny or minimize the role of other far more important players in that job.
Right. And I totally agree. I mean, it is kind of skeevy. I think we can go too far in the other direction and say, and kind of take this nihilistic view that Governor Johnson has. He's probably in a bad mood because of not being invited to the debates and so on, and say that nobody's creating jobs and it's all just market forces, which is also kind of an approximate way to describe it rather than a fully accurate one. You would think that if somebody was making a great effort to create jobs and a very canny effort to create jobs, that that propensity on their part would be nationally celebrated, identified, and replicated, perhaps. And so maybe that's an issue of sort of our fractious discourse that we can get into a bit later here. I think there are some states that have done relatively cagey things in creating jobs. One of them, I think, is a good example, is actually North Carolina, which took a lot of money from the tobacco settlement and wisely used it to set up a lot of training programs for biotech. And that was, I think, just a pretty sensible use of the money, because they were thinking, we have a large pool of unemployed workers who were in tobacco, and we have these big universities in the center of the state that are going to be doing research in this field. So we can put this money into retraining the workforce that will build the things that they design. And it's turned into a big sector for them.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And that kind of segues us into another kind of high quality job, or sort of more desirable job, which is the green job. And this is like a phrase that has almost a talismanic power at this point. If it's a green job, it's better, it's shinier, it's a superior job in all ways, and worth kind of an extra sentence in a stump speech. And I wonder, I hate to sound, I guess, like a broken record about the broken window fallacy, but this is something that just comes up over and over and over in these debates, which is, it's not clear to me, and we have actually a great piece up at reason.com by Jacob Sullum, which we'll link to in the sidebar about this, but green jobs are more expensive in sort of substantial ways, in part because green technologies are more expensive to both to sort of build and to consume. And why?
It's kind of
sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
And just this sort of odd notion that it would be a good thing to spend more money per job, and then later to spend more money per, say, light bulb, is a little bit unclear to me. I mean, there might be good reasons to spend more money on a light bulb, but that is money that's not being used for something else. And I think that's always difficult to keep sight of in these debates. When we're talking about subsidizing a solar power plant, that's, the money that would cost to build a coal plant plus some other money that's now not being used for something else, to oversimplify it insanely. So I guess maybe, I would just be interested in your take on why it is that we have this kind of feeling that green jobs are worth paying a premium for, when, as you said at the beginning of our discussion, maybe shouldn't any job do? Shouldn't we want, the most jobs per dollar spent?
Right. I think you're absolutely right about the sort of talismanic quality of the phrase. It's just like thrown into these debates as kind of a stop the conversation moment. I mean, who's going to object to green jobs? It sounds so virtuous and so environmentally friendly and so economically efficient and everything.
It's awesome because they are both jobs and green. Do you see that?
Yeah, and the thing is, what's crazy about it is that for all of the phrases repeated ad nauseum, it's actually kind of, it's a phrase that implies the problem with that kind of program, right? Because in these two words, you have two goals, and they're not necessarily compatible. They're not as compatible as we would hope. So the nice thing about green jobs is they have these positive externalities, wherein you're generating clean energy, or you're building a new industry, or just styling yourself as a wonderfully friendly place to be a friend of the environment and so on. But those goals, while very worthy, are not necessarily the same as the goal of just creating jobs. And it's true of insofar as green jobs are often about renewable energy. Energy is a capital-intensive industry. When you think about it that way, you can kind of predict that the amount of money required to create the jobs isn't going to be as little as it is when you're creating jobs in just manufacturing non-green things, for example. So we actually, in Texas, people don't talk about green jobs so much, but they actually do kind of create green jobs. It's a big wind power state, for example. And last year, the comptroller came out with a report because in 2001, the state passed a property tax credit to renewable energy, which is mostly wind in Texas, and clean coal projects and R&D projects. And so they looked at the numbers, what breaks had been given, and they found that for wind, the state had given $733 million in property tax credits to renewable projects and created about 500 jobs, which works out to being like $1.5 million per job, which is completely absurd. So that looks terrible, and it's the kind of thing that if it was happening under stimulus funds at the national level would be seen as a total joke. Except that you could kind of argue that in Texas, the point of the program wasn't just to create jobs. The point was to create industry in a rural area that didn't have that industry before, and now it has it because it's the leading wind power state. And since it has it, it's not going to go away anytime soon. So I think these kind of trade-offs can be thought through, and I think you can still make a case for these kinds of investments, as expensive as they are. But the danger in phrasing them as this is the solution to our jobs problem and our climate change problem and our image problem abroad is that you're not really going to get that effect as soon as you're hoping.
And that might actually just be a rule of thumb for this kind of thing, right? If some policy is going to solve like 80% of our major presenting problems as a nation, there's probably a hole in the logic somewhere.
Right, and I would be delighted to be proved wrong about that, but I think you're probably right.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about whether or not David Brooks is a sap. Yesterday, he wrote a column in which he sort of says that he was suckered by Obama, not just once, but over and over and over and over. And then he ends the column saying, but I still kind of think his heart is in the right place and everything could work out. But then, as I said, I'm a sap.
Right.
What do you make of this from sort of a prominent conservative, a booster of Republicans, that he's both confessing his strange, desperate love for Obama and repudiating it at the same time? And what does that mean for kind of the position of partisanship in the United States right now?
Well, I don't know if I could offer any commentary on David Brooks's emotional response to Barack Obama. I think it seems like clearly a lot of Obama supporters are disappointed in aspects of the presidency. Actually, I guess Brooks is sort of outside the norm in his among the category of people who are disappointed. Brooks might be an outlier because what he's saying is that he thought the president was going to be more serious and substantive and work harder to compromise, if I'm recalling this column correctly. Mm-hmm. And he says that now Obama's gone kind of talking about class war and has gone sort of fiery and barnstorming, and Brooks doesn't like that. But I think actually a lot of Democrats at least seem like they want a little more of this fiery attitude from Obama because they think he's been trying too hard to play nicely with congressional Republicans. But the thing about this question that Brooks raises about the appropriate approach to politics and policy is that it seems like voters actually do sort of endorse the more temperate stance. We saw a new poll from CBS, I guess, a few days ago, asking people, is it better or would you rather politicians compromise on their positions or stick to their guns, even if it means you get less done? And by overwhelming margins, they all said it's better to compromise. Democrats were like ahead of Republicans on that. It was like 92% of Democrats wanted to compromise, but even Republicans, it was like a 73-22 split, which is not the impression you get if you're reading coverage of the summer's debt crisis, for example. So it raises the question. I think we have to consider the hypothesis that maybe people are more reasonable than politicians.
So another kind of, I guess, data point on that is the Reason Foundation, which is the nonprofit that publishes Reason magazine, has recently started a polling project. And the idea is to just kind of ask some follow-up questions and questions with a different angle from some of the mainstream polls that are already out there. And one thing that we found in our last poll, which I found pretty interesting, is that the supposed third rail of entitlements in American politics, mm-hmm. which poll after poll after poll shows that people of all parties, all affiliations, don't want touched. The right. sort of government hands off my Medicare thing. That if you ask them, would you be willing to consider cuts or reforms if, for instance, you got out as much money as you put in? People will say yes. It's like 60% say yes. Now, that suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of the way that, in particular, Social Security and Medicare work. But it also suggests that people are more open to reform than maybe politicians want them to be, right? Like right now, it's great cover for politicians to say, listen, I know entitlements are a huge disaster, but what can I do? My constituents are totally unwilling to have these programs touched in any way.
Right.
When in fact, if you ask people slightly more detailed questions, it turns out they say, like, listen, I am open to some kinds of reform. I just don't want to get screwed. Now, maybe it's impossible to do any reforms that would make a difference without screwing some people. I think that's in fact likely, but it's still a different thing. And I think sort of dovetails with what you're saying, that people are actually open to, and that 60% finding was Democrats and Republicans. So, even people who you would expect to be more opposed to reforms aren't. They're the same as their compatriots on the other side of the aisle. So that may suggest, again, a kind of softer attitude toward compromise on issues that politicians are most likely to kind of wave the flag on.
Right, and it's interesting because I think those polling results sort of correspond to the lived experience that I would imagine most of us have in the United States, which is that you don't walk around seeing people screaming at each other all the time, and if on the occasions when you end up outside of your coffee shop or something and start asking people what they think, usually it's not like an extremely tense discussion. So I think that there is, you're right, in interrogating the data, we do find these areas where people are more open to discussion. I guess paradoxically, if you're more open to discussion and more open to genuinely having a reform effort, you can also simultaneously express that very strongly, or express your view very strongly, because you would think, let's really fight it out, hash it out, and we'll end up somewhere in the middle. Or if I lose this fight, I'm going to be okay with that. So maybe the signal to noise ratio is too high from everyone when they have this underlying comity. The data point, I guess, in weighing against that is that we didn't especially see in this last election cycle the more moderate candidates or the more measured candidates winning. We saw sort of an uptick in charismatic Republicans in 2010. And maybe we won't know until 2012 whether there's still a sense of rabble-rousing, or whether everyone's kind of calming down and wanting to work together. But you do hear people say pretty consistently on both sides that they want solutions, and they think the other side is the one creating the obstruction.
Although I also think you have, then this has been a staple of Obama's rhetoric for a long time. He always says that he's looking to kind of transcend the same old political debates or the same old partisan squabbles, right? That's kind of his stance, is that he's this guy. He's compromise guy. He's going to bring the two sides together. And I think, what he often means by that is, shut up, Republicans, you're wrong. Right. I also think that, we've been sort of good, friendly Americans have been brought up to just like the word compromise. If you say, hey, are you willing to compromise? People will always say yes, because they're good guys. But that word may actually be a little bit stripped of meaning in the kind of like Orwellian, democracy, truth, liberty. It may just be one of those.
I can't wait for you to all come compromise with me.
Exactly. When you compromise by agreeing that I'm right about everything, we will have a better polity.
I guess it might be one of those questions, though, too, that sometimes you see people assume these phenomena in political life are real, and what it actually is that nobody's tried it out yet. So we're not going to go into Social Security today, but with Perry on Social Security, he's kind of talking a very strict line, and people were saying, wow, that's really going to alienate older voters, and then polls have shown that older voters are still supporting him among the Republican primary candidates. So so some of these third rails maybe aren't quite as electrified as we think they are.
The metaphor train just ran away with you a little bit there.
Yeah, I think, as I said, it's been a long week. But another thing I kind of wonder with this issue too is thinking about these sort of, it's like a cardinal sin in American politics to flip flop. Like people. Even if you flip-flop, right, presumably at one point or the other you're on everyone's side because you flip-flopped. But people think the act of floppery in itself is just a heinous thing to do, and they really hold it against people who are seen to flip-flop. And I think that's a little strange because it often seems pretty plausible that a politician could say, yeah, I thought that then, and either I realized I was wrong, or I'm now campaigning for a different unit of government where the dynamic is different, or situations have changed around me such that what was a good idea 10 years ago is no longer a good idea because of different economic dynamics or whatever. I don't know why we don't see that kind of argument more often, or why we don't see it received calmly. Like when Mitt Romney says that Massachusetts wanted healthcare reform, so he supported it, but the U.S. Didn't want Obamacare 7 years later, so he's against it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you've constructed a plausible story about why politicians might change their minds, but that, in fact, the American people rightly suspect their politicians of changing their minds for purely pragmatic reasons for winning elections. That in fact, when politicians do change their minds for sort of clear, principled reasons, maybe people are more tolerant of that. Maybe they're not, because maybe it just makes sense as a sort of a shorthand device, right? This is the sort of idea of rational ignorance that voters probably shouldn't pay a lot of attention to the ins and outs of politics because they have better things to do with their time. So a good shorthand is to just say, listen, if that guy changed his mind, I assume it's because he's an unprincipled douchebag who just wants my vote.
Is there a plausible way to defend electoral opportunism? I mean, do you think it? I mean, again, while I'm constructing wild narratives over here, do you think it would be plausible for a politician to say, yeah, I'm against this thing, but I can see that the majority of voters are in favor of this thing. Therefore, I'm going to, act in their interest because I'm just one guy. I mean, I'm the governor of the state or whatever, but I'm not God, so I'm not going to abrogate their will on every issue unless I see a clear injustice or constitutional problem or so on.
Yeah, and I think sometimes politicians do that, but it's again, our system is set up in such a way that they can kind of have it both ways, right? You sent me here because I'm a man of principle and I'm going to do what I think is right, or you sent me here as a representative of the people and I'm going to do what you think is right. And they have this sort of like very convenient situation where they can just choose whether they want to offer justification A or justification B, and while I think sometimes justification A is the right one and sometimes justification B is the right one, the American people are really skeptical when both are offered in convenient moments.
Yeah, so maybe it's a kind of just a timing and context thing, as so many things in life are. But let me ask you kind of this version of the question: what are the issues that are? What are the features of issues that are most intractable? I was thinking this morning, maybe it's that the issues that have a moral dimension or somehow based on subjective ideas about morality are the ones that we just can't get past. So kind of culture war stuff like abortion or the death penalty, which I think we'll talk about later on in this call. Those seem pretty stubborn because each side just thinks the other side is wrong. But then I don't know how an issue like climate change would fit into that framework because it's not really a moral issue in itself, I don't think, like whether the science is valid.
I think the moral dimension thing hints at it, but I actually think it's probably the phrase that I would use would just be, the word that I would use would be identity. So it's not really about, I feel strongly that abortion is a moral issue, and so I'm going to vote accordingly. For many people, it's I am the kind of person who supports the kind of person who opposes abortion.
And I think it's tribal, I guess.
Right. Well, I mean, we're tribal creatures, and I think all you have to do is go out and see like a touch football game where you put blue shirts on one set of guys and red shirts on the other set of guys, and by the end of the game, people are like, "Death to blue!" It's these things are not hard to kind of gin up, and our political system is has over hundreds of years refined the use and abuse of that kind of human trait. And I think one place we saw this, actually, to go ahead and get into it, is with the death penalty cheer for Rick Perry during the Republican debate, and a lot of people commented on that, and I think it was sort of a chilling moment to hear what seemed to be people saying raw, violent execution of violent man, because we fancy ourselves sort of more civilized than that, right? We fancy ourselves kind of somehow, we are not the people who go to public hangings with a picnic for fun anymore.
Right.
Although we were pretty recently, it's worth noting.
Well, it was a quieter era.
Right. But I think what people were actually cheering for is, hey, he's the kind of guy who, if push comes to shove, will do that kind of thing. Raw Rick Perry.
And who's not going to make any apologies for it, and so on. But I guess these two things could. I think that's doubtless an element of this, but it seems like it's not quite mutually exclusive with people actually believing in it. I mean, the death penalty is such a weird issue because, it's macabre to think of anybody benefiting from an execution. Because if you're in the position of being directly affected by it, you've already suffered a pretty grievous loss if you're a family of the victim or so on. But people word it much more strongly than would seem to make sense, given that so few of them are among the families of the victims, just across the population. I mean, the odds of any of us being involved in a death penalty case are minimal. And yet the support is very staunch, even when people acknowledge the massive problems with it. So we see these polling results, for example, from Gallup, which find that about a 2/3 majority of Americans support the death penalty. That's been about the same since they started polling like 70 years ago on the question. And a majority of Americans also believe somebody innocent has been executed in the past 5 years. Not somebody in particular, just somebody in general. If you put those numbers together, it's like fully a third of people in the country believe somebody innocent has been executed, which I think we can all agree is a pretty monstrous injustice. And continue to support the death penalty. To me, that just seems really crazy.
And yet I think you see that on a lot of issues. I mean, the death penalty issue is something where it's just this incredibly stark life and death issue. But, the drug war is another place where you see that depending on which polls you look at, we still have a majority of people who support significant prohibitions on drugs, support the war on drugs. And yet virtually everyone knows cases of people whose lives have been ruined by smoking a little bit of weed and getting caught at it. So I think, we may be seeing possibly just the American public's ability to hold A and not A in their minds at the same time with utter ease and happiness.
Which when you put it that way, sounds very epistemologically advanced of us.
Unfortunately, it's not a talent so much as it's a bug, not a feature. But although maybe it is. I mean, it is a feature also, right? I mean, to sort of get into some probably totally unfair and oversimplistic evolutionary explanations, right? Again, we can't be spending all of our time worrying about the moral implications of the death penalty. You can't wake up in the middle of the night freaked out about that all the time. So you just have to say, I believe A and not A, and move on sometimes.
Well, maybe kind of create that sort of psychological comfort zone of, so in this case, the reason we were going to bring it up was because there's this guy scheduled to be executed this evening in Georgia, and Troy Davis. He was convicted in 1989 of shooting a cop based on eyewitness testimony from 9 people. I think 7 of them later recanted and told about police having pressured them. So this execution has been scheduled several times, stayed several times, and was finally given yet another go-ahead that apparently will be the final go-ahead on the 20th, which is yesterday. But so in these cases where there are at the very least substantial issues, maybe people go to the psychological comfort of, well, we don't know, we weren't there, he probably did it, maybe he did it, we can't be sure.
There's also this extra layer, which I always find troubling in these discussions, which is the police officer victim layer. The idea that somehow killing a cop is worse than killing anybody else. And I get why the justice system would want harsher penalties for sort of the death of one of their own. I mean, to personify the justice system and oversimplify again. But, it was an off-duty police officer, I think, who was killed. And I think a pretty significant portion, I forget the number now, but a pretty significant portion of death penalty cases do have to do with cop killings. And so, if we believe that this process is flawed, and if we believe that there's sort of a tremendous amount of fallibility, to then add this overlay where we, for some reason, are more likely to send a cop killer to the electric chair, even when they didn't know that it was a cop. And this is, of course, the case of Corey May, which Reason Magazine has covered extensively. A guy who was put on death row for shooting a cop when his house was broken into in the middle of the night, and he says he thought it was intruders, and how would he know it was cops? And he actually got off. He's free now, partially thanks to Reason's coverage of the issue. But again, sort of really central to that debate was the fact that it was a cop, and I guess I wonder why we're especially indulgent in that case.
Well, I'm not that troubled by that particular intuition, because it seems like in these cases, and when it is a cop, I mean, whoever shot the cop in question in this Troy Davis case, he was an off-duty cop, but he was working as a security guard, and apparently he was intervening to break up a fight with the killer, was sort of beating up a homeless guy in the parking lot of a Burger King in Georgia or something. And so there, without saying that anybody deserves to be shot, I mean, when a police officer is shot, usually they're not only not involved in what's going on, but they're trying to stop something. Not in the Corey May case, obviously, but in a lot of these cases. We also, I guess the law, I'm not sure how it is in Georgia, but in Texas at least, it would be you can't get death, or you're not supposed to be able to get the death penalty unless you have an exacerbating circumstance with the murder and you don't have any mitigating things. So you'll see death sentences for murder plus rape or murder plus burglary. And actually, another thing I think that strikes me about covering this, and I'm against the death penalty, but I'm aware that's the minority view, is that a lot of people seem to think it's, or they'll describe it as being really an issue of justice. I mean, they'll say that the victims were deprived of their lives and brutally treated, often very viciously treated, and executing the offender provides them with justice, retroactively provides their family with justice that otherwise isn't achieved by sending the killer to jail. And I don't really agree with that intuition, but I think it's a comprehensible intuition, or I think it's plausible given the premises.
Sure, and if you're in a ethics class 101 in college, this is something that you'll be presented with as a kind of ongoing debate, right? Is it retributive? Is it preventive? Is it
right?
So I think this is something that is probably not going to be resolved in this blogging heads, among other things, but that people do have this kind of gut feeling of like eye for an eye somewhere back there, in their minds, but at the same time can recognize that this particular eye extraction technique is completely flawed and like winds up like digging out people's noses all the times instead.
Right, and so I think it's important for us to kind of say, maybe we can just kind of conclude this death penalty part of the talk on this, but it seems like the cheering at that debate, which was a really strange moment, corroborates the narrative that is occasionally told about Americans that they just love executions, and that there's this river of enthusiasm for it throughout the country. But I think that that's probably not quite the case. It might be that they feel embattled, or the supporters feel embattled, and they do see it as justice. But I think that bloodlust in general is kind of a dwindling resource in the world, which is cheerful.
So the next topic that we had slated to talk about is sort of equally not cheerful, which is the abysmal state of public education, particularly for Black kids in America, but I guess there is a little bit of a silver lining, which is the yesterday's announcement of the MacArthur Genius Grant for Roland Fryer, who has done some pretty interesting work on ways to solve that problem. In particular, he supports incentives, so paying kids to who do well on exams, tests of various kinds for good performance, with the explicit goal of closing the achievement gap, of closing the gap between white students and black students in this country. It's pretty controversial work for obvious reasons, and I wonder if the Genius Grant will expose him to more condemnation, or if it will get some of his techniques picked up, because I do think we're kind of in a moment where education policy folk are in a let's try anything mode.
Right.
Now, there are institutional reasons why let's try anything gets pretty watered down by the time you actually get to action, but do you think, what's your response to this kind of pay kids for grades experiment?
Well, I'm all for it. I mean, I think when we were kids, we used to get paid with like M&Ms and stuff for whatever. But do you think this work is controversial outside of sort of the interest groups that are always incensed by these things, or do you think this is a broadly controversial approach?
Probably not. Certainly lots of parents in this country pay their kids for good grades already, either in M&M form or in cash form or in cell phone form or whatever. But I almost think it doesn't matter much what kind of the typical American parent thinks about his work. What matters is what kind of institutional opponents to this kind of school reform think.
Right.
And the fact that he is very, very explicit about the race angle, I think, is what makes him a more controversial figure. That Fryer is black, and he was raised in like a pretty seriously dysfunctional household, and he, I think, was tenured at Harvard at the age of like 30 or something, just incredibly successful. Yeah. And he has always been very explicit that about the racial angle, whereas I think other education reformers will kind of say minority students are getting short shrift in particular as a kind of subordinate clause in their broader reform proposal. So I think that's also an element of we'd rather not look straight at the racial angle of how screwed up our education system is, and he's asking us to do that.
Right, and I think that actually, one thing that's kind of interesting about it, and you know more about his work than I do, I think. But it seemed like with some of his early research, at least, or leading into these programs, he was saying that when he was doing the research and with some colleagues, they found that if you control for socioeconomic factors, white and black kids enter school with at the same level, and then the gaps just kind of start emerging early, and then they widen over time. And he thinks that there is an effect of norms, I guess, and of peer pressure, maybe competition for after-school activities between homework and whatever else. So I guess in that sense, can the incentives that he's describing change the norms?
Well, I do think more and more the consensus is that the culture of a school is a dominant factor, that classroom size and available resources and whatever else, there's sort of these cycles of trendy explanations for what's going on, that some kids succeed and some kids fail, and now classroom culture is a big deal. And if you saw the documentary Waiting for Superman, there's this chart where you see the academic performance, or the test performance of black and white students diverge, I think starting in about 4th grade, and just, this incredible gap by the time they get to 8th grade that essentially can't be made up. And then you see schools like KIPP and other kind of places where culture is a huge focus, where, there's sort of no excuses culture, there's a, academics first culture, and those schools have the ability to close those gaps and to bring kids even black kids up over above their white counterparts in some cases. Whether that is another trendy explanation that will fall by the wayside, I don't know. But certainly his work does feed into that idea that you have to avoid the soft bigotry of low expectations, to borrow a phrase
that we all love. And I think certainly it's a worthwhile thing to explore. I mean, the gap is obvious, and it seems like it's been intractable despite a lot of previous voguish reform efforts. So if these programs work, then I think that the institutional opposition is going to have to be shouted down if something's getting good results. I think, though, he's consulted with Houston schools on a pilot program that just launched last year, and I think their data so far has been, I'm not sure if it's been conclusive, but I don't think it's shown like a wild, immediate improvement. It seems like I think that administrators have said that you need to look at the microdata, so not just did kids start passing this math test in greater numbers, but what was the improvement? Even if they didn't get to the passing threshold, did they do better? So really kind of break it down, kind of the way you do with job creation. I mean, is this a good job for this community, or based on the historical standards, or are we getting better over time?
And there's definitely some parallels here to merit pay for teachers, where it actually turns out to be surprisingly hard to see the mechanisms, especially in advance, to see the mechanisms whereby students or teachers will respond to this offered incentive. So, and how the incentives are structured matters a lot. So, for instance, in New York City, it turned out that a lot of the incentives that were offered to teachers were, for good performance, were tied to school-wide performance, grade level performance, so things that each individual teacher maybe didn't have control over. While there's still sort of a very live debate about whether that should happen at all or to what extent, what sounds like a pretty simple idea, hey, pay teachers whose kids do better, turns out to have lots and lots of ways that it could be implemented, many of which miss the point entirely or even have the opposite response from what's intended, which is to sort of make teachers feel more helpless and more kind of trapped by mediocre colleagues or subpar administrators. And I think the same thing could be happening with kids too.
It's interesting though. I mean, do you think it's kind of random, but do you feel like you personally respond to incentives in predictable ways? Are you conscious of what you're doing when you're responding to an incentive laid out before you?
Sure. I mean, I think one great example is freelance work for journalists. I mean, when I take a freelance gig, I sort of say, hey, that sounds like a good rate. And then I say, oh, no, wait, I'm actually not going to make $500 or $1,000 for this piece because I've just set aside X amount for taxes. So let me remember what I'm really making and then make my decision, right? So in that case, I would respond to a change in the tax structure as to whether or not I wrote another freelance piece. Now, should the goal of government policy be to get Katherine Mangu-Ward to accept more freelance assignments? Definitely, I think.
Yes, but I agree with that.
But that's just, I mean, that's a micro example, but I think people respond to those kind of incentives all the time. That said, if somebody said to me, hey, will you, eat this goldfish for $1? $1's not enough. I'm not even going to acknowledge that offer. And so I think that's also been an issue with merit pay for teachers, is if you offer a teacher, $200 to work 20% harder, it's the $1 for the goldfish. They're just going to say, screw you. Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely some possibility for backfiring when you make these ridiculous propositions like eat this goldfish for $1, which is, I mean, $1, it's pocket change. But this does raise, I think, our final issue, which is also a very tricky issue, which is that
this is the best segue ever.
This wonderful young man, Charles Kenny at Foreign Policy, has written an article, which is sort of in the category of things that are arguably sophistic, but nonetheless plausible justifications for things we were wanting to do anyway, which is saying, all the goldfish you want, just don't buy into this sort of tyranny of organic food, locally sourced hemp products. Just do what you're already doing. That's actually better for farmers in the developing world and so on. Are you for or against?
I love this as a framework, both for selfish reasons and for principled reasons. Selfishly, I like the idea of being able to have a response when you're sort of at the inevitable dinner party conversation where, I'm a locavore with vegan overlay. No, I'm more of a pescatarian with, Klingon aesthetics, like whatever. People, people now have these incredibly refined categories for what they eat. And by people, I mean the awful yuppies that I hang out with. And, to kind of say, well, I kind of eat everything because is not great. To say, oh, well, I'm a cosmovore. And I think, his thesis is a little bit stronger than how you characterize it. He actually is saying, listen, there are competing ethical and moral claims that argue in favor of eating, industrially produced food. And you can, the example that he uses, which is a pretty tired example at this point, but nonetheless powerful, is lamb grown in New Zealand, frozen and sent across on a boat, is far more energy efficient to the point of being sort of a net global warming gain rather than lamb grown in the Hudson Valley and like brought still bleeding to the New York green market, right? So, that's one argument, but I think the argument that's far more compelling is to just say, listen, the more obsessed we become with like closing in our commercial circle by shrinking the world from which we, in which we buy and sell, the less we get, both from an efficiency standpoint, why would we be growing things in greenhouses in the United States when they could be grown in incredibly poor countries with low labor costs and fantastic weather? And also that, there's this sort of affirmative good of saying, buy stuff produced by poorer people because then they have jobs. And this is also a response that I think came up in the sweatshop movement, the anti-sweatshop movement in the early aughts. And I actually, I have a bracelet, one of those rubber bracelets like for cancer, which says, it's gray, and it says on it, I buy goods from poorer countries, or I buy goods made in poorer countries.
Oh, that's what gray is.
As a moral, ethical statement, and I stand by that.
Was it made in a sweatshop? Is that?
I assume so. I assume that they sourced these rubber bands, probably, to be fair, in exactly the same place that all the other ones are sourced. They're just proud about it.
Yeah, it's and I guess these arguments can get into sort of as much as we're joking about how great it is to have this excuse, it can get to kind of specious territory because you can imagine. At some point, say we price carbon differently, then maybe the New Zealand lamb is actually the worst bet, and maybe regardless of the cost of transportation, the best thing is just for everyone to eat more lentils or quinoa and so on, if that can be born. But yeah, it's an interesting article for sure, in kind of, I think, provoking us to just be more aware of our glib moral presumptions.
Well, it has been excellent sharing glib moral presumptions with you, and
I'm just full of them.
And I hope to talk to you again soon on Blogging Heads or elsewhere.
Absolutely. Have a great afternoon, Katherine.
You too.
All right, bye.